There was no consensus, and the treaty will not emerge from this process. But the treaty is coming.
The United States is disappointed that this conference was unable to reach consensus today. We look forward to the adoption of this strong treaty by the General Assembly.
Draft resolution is adopted.
Today, we open for signature the landmark arms trade treaty.
We have a good framework, and we are making a strong start today with so many signatures.
So now we have the words on the paper. We need the action on the ground.
Although the signature process is now underway, 50 countries still need to ratify this treaty before it goes into effect. That could take up to 2 years. Secretary of State John Kerry has made clear, though, that President Obama will sign this treaty as soon as their review process is complete. But as Ambassador John Bolton told me, the administration's decision to allow the treaty to reach this point is a miscarriage of our democracy.
There's no reason for the United States to have allowed this to come to a vote in the General Assembly and voted for it if they didn't already know what their position on the treaty was. I think the administration said for a long time that it would not agree to any arms trade treaty that didn't emerge with full consensus among the negotiators. That was always unlikely.
How convenient. They abandoned consensus. The election is over.
Yeah, that's a violation of a commitment they made to the American people, and I think it tells us a lot about the administration's strategy going forward. The agenda here is to achieve by indirection what they were not able to achieve in the House and the Senate.
As it sometimes happens in Washington, some of those have crossed the line from passionate advocacy of their position into outright misrepresentation. This treaty in no way touches constitutional rights under the Second Amendment of American citizens.
Look, the president and many in his administration say that the arms trade treaty recognizes the use of firearms for hunting and sports purposes. But let's be clear, it does so in the preamble to the treaty. Preambles have no binding effect. If they were serious about it, it would have been an article in the treaty itself. So I think the game is up here. I think President Obama is the most committed to the UN and multilateral organizations of any president we've ever had. I think the arms trade treaty is one of many devices that he will use to get us more involved and to constrain the United States from acting independently. So the president is restricting Americans' ability to defend themselves when their government can't. It's a very dangerous period for the United States, and it will be until his term ends. That's another reason why defeating this treaty is so important. We don't need international treaties to tell us what policies to pursue here at home. We'll debate that among ourselves. We're actually capable of governing ourselves. We don't need the UN to help us do it.
You've got countries like Russia and China saying they're not going to sign the treaty. So that means that something like 90% of the firearms produced in the world won't be covered by this treaty. Is that an effective treaty, or is it just symbolic?
For the international aspects, this is simply a feel-good treaty. Over 100 countries, I would say, will ratify this treaty and pay absolutely no attention to it. And it will be their weapons that come into the hands of terrorists and rogue states and state sponsors of terrorism. So the treaty will restrict those who don't need restrictions, and it won't restrict those who don't plan to pay any attention to it. By contrast, from the United States point of view, we have the most effective, some would say too effective, system of licensing the international sale of weapons of any country on earth. We don't need an international treaty on the arms trade to comply with the legal obligations Congress has already imposed.
I can't see why there should be opposition to a United States hope that other citizens meet the same standards that the United States Congress has insisted upon for decades.
The idea that the rest of the world is suddenly going to conform to our arms export control system is silly. They don't have any intention of coming anywhere close to us. That's why the pursuit of this treaty, the dogged pursuit of this treaty over 20 years, is only explainable in terms of a domestic U.S. gun control agenda.
John, we're not just talking about a treaty. We're talking about years and years of many of these anti-gun countries pushing amendments that will only strengthen the treaty. Shouldn't that raise all kinds of red flags with gun owners and supporters of the Second Amendment?
I think what's going on here is that the administration is trying to find ways to be sure that it can take the treaty to the Senate and say this has nothing to do with domestic gun control, when in fact they know that's exactly what the ulterior motive here is. The treaty is very vague, there's no question about it. That's part of its benefit because it allows them to argue down the road that we're compelled. Congress is required to pass domestic legislation, a domestic gun registry, and other steps to implement the treaty. And the question is whether the senators who have already said they're not going to accept the treaty that reaches into our domestic law like this is anything they'll allow to be ratified.
So the president signs the treaty. All eyes, no doubt, will now be on the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, I think the focus is going to be on the Senate for some time to come. We have a Secretary of State and a President who both support domestic gun control very stringently, and there's no doubt in my mind they're going to try and get this treaty through as a very high priority sometime in the next few years. So get ready because it's coming. It's just a question, tactically, of how the administration presents it.
You've always called this president, as long as I've interviewed, a post-American president. By him signing this treaty, does that support that?
I think he's a post-American president because he puts his ideological objectives above the best interest of the United States. And it's clear to me that this arms trade treaty is intended to undercut the Second Amendment. That's the purpose of it. That's what being a post-American president means. This Constitution, to those who view it that way, is an unnecessary, outdated restriction on their power. And I think most Americans still see the Constitution as a protection of our liberties, which is why we need to defend it. So if we were to ratify this, it'd be like putting a sign on our back that says, "Kick me."